Hello, kittens. It's me, Luis, a disembodied voice that some of you might recognize as LMGM from Room for Resistance. I wish I could be there with you in the flesh, but at this very moment I'm in an airplane somewhere over the Atlantic, preparing for the back-to-school season. Super exciting. I'm here, or at least my voice is here, to talk about queer space-making and queer world-making through the lens of queer utopianism on the dance floor. My focus here is not so much on utopia itself, but on utopianism, on how people focus on utopia, on the desire of and yearning for and reaching to and building towards a better world than the one we're given. For this talk, I've taken some text from the introduction to a book that I'm writing called Together Somehow: Music, Affect, and Intimacy on the Dance Floor. A book that takes the utopianism of queer dance floors quite seriously, not just the successes, but the failures too. I'm interested in how strangers manage to get along on dance floors, and also what happens when they don't. I'm interested in what music and vibrations have to do with that intimacy, what feelings and dancing bodies have to do with it, and sex and gender and touch and many other factors. But today my goal is to give you a brief history of queer utopianism on the dance floor, from disco onwards. So here we go. The tricky thing about dance floors is that they are places where both inclusion and exclusion happen. Whether subtle or conspicuous, club cultures always find ways to signal who is welcome to join in on the dance. Electronic dance music scenes tend to emphasize their inclusivity while downplaying their exclusions. This tendency can be traced back to their subcultural origins, from the clandestine, hidden, queer of color dance parties of early disco to the mass gatherings of suburban youth in the 1990s rave era. Electronic dance music scenes share a history of utopian longing for radically open inclusivity, especially for those who experience exclusion everywhere else in society. As a result, these music scenes avoid explicit or open discussion of who belongs and how, instead relying on vague references to shared musical tastes, to open-mindedness and good vibes, quote unquote. This strategic vagueness is both a help and a hindrance, enabling dancers to temporarily enjoy a moment of belonging unburdened by the difficult work of identity politics, so to speak, while at the same time this enables them to ignore the exclusions and injustices taking place on these same dance floors. Such vagueness helps to sustain social worlds that can feel exhilaratingly expansive and yet also precarious, liable to disintegrate as soon as their underlying tensions are exposed. How do dancers and partygoers get along in these fluid social contexts, where learning the details of other dancers' identities, values, and political affinities risks undermining their utopian fantasy of universal togetherness? On our dance floors, belonging is supported by face-to-face encounters with strangers. This stranger sociability lends a sense of openness to these parties, making nightlife scenes feel like something more expansive and welcoming than a closed community. But such fluidity and anonymity also makes our scenes very fragile. All of this vagueness can lead just as easily to feelings of disappointment, betrayal, and exclusion. Being a stranger can be strangely liberating, creating a feeling of freedom from the constraints of social norms and identities and relationships, but it can also be risky. It can be unpredictable and lonely. And yet, despite these risks, countless partygoers go out every weekend and find intimacy among strangers. Thriving and perishing in the urban interstices, that is, in the gaps inside city maps, these temporary nocturnal worlds take on a glowing utopian halo for many of us. Queer nightlife spaces provide a somewhere else where different ways of being and being together can be imagined, practiced, and enjoyed. Feeling utopian on the dance floor. A very short history. The dance floor. For a long time, the dance floor has served as a symbol for a better world than this one. Thriving at the center of electronic music culture, they are celebrated as places of self-invention, experimentation, escape, comfort, refuge, transformation, connection, and communion. For marginalized partygoers, dance floors are a place where the injustices and indignities of everyday life can be dissolved, healed, and maybe forgotten. Since dance floors can serve as spaces for experimentation with ways of living together that are better, more just, more caring, more fulfilling, or simply less harmful, they also serve as spaces for utopianism. But this is not to suggest that nightclubs and raves are fully realized utopias, far from it, but rather I argue that their dance floors are utopian in spirit. They provide concrete sites and real spaces for the collective envisioning of a different kind of good life. Starting from the disco era, you can trace a line of commentators and scholars writing about the utopian aspects of dance floors and the music that animates them. In 1979, at the height of disco's mainstream popularity, Richard Dyer published the essay In Defense of Disco in The Gay Left, a British Marxist socialist journal that was written by gay men. He argued for the political relevance of disco against the criticism of his colleagues on the political left. He did so by pointing to disco's almost successful mainstreaming of non-heteroeroticism, its subversion of rock and folk ideals of naturalness and authenticity, its valuing of pleasure without shame, its vision of a utopian flight from banality, a flight from everyday boringness and ordinariness, and that flight comes through romantic extremes of emotion, and also for its role as a utopian refuge for sexual minorities. Nearly a decade later, in 1986, a singer and producer of high-energy disco named David Diebold described gay dance clubs in San Francisco as utopian safe havens in his memoirs, which were entitled Tribal Rights. Since then, a growing archive of personal memoirs, journalism, and scholarship continues to expand and to complicate this utopian view of queer dance floors as sites of refuge and self-fashioning. One important complication that they often pointed out was that these spaces were still organized by hierarchies of beauty, coolness, fabulousness, masculinity, and wealth. Notably, most of these analyses focus on the nightlife scenes of marginalized groups, especially where they intersected, such as the queer, Black, and Latinx crowds of the early New York disco scene. For generations of dance music fans, the disco scene of 1970s downtown Manhattan has been remembered as a sort of nostalgic utopia, lost in the past. But even during the early years of the disco era, people were describing the downtown disco scene in utopian terms. For example, New York music journalist Vince Aletti, who wrote the first report on New York's new disco clubs for Rolling Stone, was struck by the social mixing at early disco parties, describing them as completely mixed, racially and sexually, where there wasn't any sense of someone being more or less important than someone else. End quote. In 1978, at the height of disco's popularity, the mayor of New York, Ed Koch, marked Disco Week. They had a Disco Week in 1978. He marked Disco Week by giving a speech in which he described disco as symbolizing, quote, a more harmonious fellowship towards all creeds and races, end quote. Diversity and integration were indeed important utopian themes for disco, and they appeared in the lyrics of gospel-inspired hits like Love Train by the OJs and Sister Sledge's We Are Family. Both of these songs invited dancers to join a community that was connected by shared feeling and music rather than by established social structures. But despite these utopian visions of open and equal belonging, systems of exclusion were part of the disco scene from the very beginning. For example, many early disco clubs had members-only policies which were justified as self-protective and legally necessary, especially for unlicensed venues, such as The Loft, David Mancuso's residence on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. But this evolved into a system of elitist social curatorships at clubs like Studio 54, which were selecting and excluding people based on beauty, celebrity, glamour, and social connections. Nonetheless, disco's utopian imaginaries continued into the era of house music, which grew out of the disco scene in Chicago. Frankie Knuckles, Ron Hardy, and other local DJs played an eclectic mix of disco, Italo-disco, funk, hip-hop, and European electropop, but what solidified the house music sound was their practice of looping the instrumental breaks of their favorite tracks on reel-to-reel tapes and intensifying the percussion with drum machines. And the success of this practice eventually led to the production of new, original tracks by local producers. As with disco, utopianism is easiest to find in the titles and lyrics of house tracks, such as Joe Smooth's Promised Land. On top of bright, high-tempo conga drums and lush, sustained synthesizer chords, vocalist Anthony Thomas sings lyrics with clear political and utopian themes, addressing the audience as brothers and sisters and invoking Christian tropes of the Promised Land, as a collective goal and as a destination. Perhaps the most well-known example of house music utopianism is Larry Heard's 1988 anthem and musical manifesto, Can You Feel It?, which was released under the moniker Fingers Incorporated. The track features a spoken word performance by Robert Owens, who uses the heightened speaking style of a black charismatic preacher to tell a musical creation story that riffs on several biblical creation myths. Quote, "In the beginning there was Jack, and Jack had a groove," end quote. Owens alludes to the book of Genesis in particular, but in his version, the musical creator god brings house music into being by proclaiming, "Let there be house," and dubbing himself the creator. But this is soon followed by the declaration that this newly created house is a collective space, in which gaining membership is as easy as stepping onto the dance floor. In these few lines, house becomes a shared utopian world, a common point of understanding, but also a feeling that is hard to describe. The dance floor becomes a festive public sphere with open membership, but requiring deep immersion and bodily surrender. As house music gained popularity in the UK and transformed into acid house, utopianism was not difficult to find in the UK's acid house clubs and raves, especially since they were also influenced by post-hippie culture still thriving on the Balearic Islands, such as Ibiza. In fact, the 1988-89 boom in acid house was dubbed the Second Summer of Love, a direct reference to the first Summer of Love in 1967, when the hippie movement became both a cultural revolution and a mass cultural phenomenon. Along with tie-dyed patterns, psychedelic graphic design, fluorescent color palettes, and smiley face icons, the UK's early electronic dance music scenes adopted a great deal of hippie-era utopian rhetoric. This included visions of universal inclusivity mixed with a surging sense of revolutionary possibility through euphoric communion. In other words, partying and dancing together made up for a better world, or it made a better world feel possible, if only for a moment. Although the UK rave scene did not always have a clear political agenda, the euphoric sense of community cultivated at these parties seemed to help dissolve that sense of stuckness that middle-class and working-class British youth felt in the face of Margaret Thatcher's neoliberal austerity politics. The post-hippie utopianism of the rave era found another incarnation across the Atlantic, as rave events became a mass cultural phenomenon in North America. From the outset, raves in North America tended to attract young, white, middle-class, suburban, and mostly straight partygoers. However, this is not to say that these rave scenes represented mainstream culture. Much like their UK and European peers, North American ravers self-identified as eccentric outsiders and differentiated themselves from a mainstream culture by cultivating their own subcultural aesthetics, fashion, slang, norms, and behaviors. Ravers in the 1990s were part of the Generation X cohort, but whereas grunge and alternative rock seemed to channel the malaise and the directionlessness of Generation X adolescence, raves promised to exchange these low-energy vibes with euphoria. Much like in the UK, rave events address the angst and alienation of an economic recession by offering refuge in collective effervescence. Although the story of acid house and raves may seem to suggest that electronic dance music left North America for Europe and then returned later as rave culture, it never disappeared from the underground queer nightlife scenes where it had first developed. In New York, prominent gay nightclubs such as the Paradise Garage and the Saint survived the disco era, and they served as incubators for new styles of dance music throughout the 80s. These late disco venues overlapped with newer clubs such as Sound Factory and Twilo, which continued New York's dance scene into the next decade. When raves came over from the UK at the beginning of the 1990s, there was already a vibrant underground dance scene in New York. Paradise Garage was especially important as a major underground dance music institution, catering to a gay crowd that was predominantly black and Latina. With legendary resident DJ Larry Levan, the club developed a particular sound, later dubbed garage or garage house, which rerouted the percussive drive of early Chicago house music back into classic disco, funk, and soul. Instead of the high-tempo, raw, jackin' sound of Chicago house, New York garage featured moderate tempos, glossy production, soulful vocal performances, and keyboard riffs reminiscent of gospel and soul. In garage music, utopian feelings remained closely tied to disco's dance floor Utopia, to which it added hypnotic grooves such as those in the iconic garage track by Serious Intention called You Don't Know, especially the special remix version of this track, which uses heavy effects on the vocals to create a dance floor experience that is ecstatic and kaleidoscopic. Even more intensely and insistently than disco, New York garage seemed to imagine the feeling of utopia as musical abandon, as getting lost in endless dancing. And so here we stop. I end this brief historical sketch of queer dance floor utopianism here, very conscious of the terrain still left uncovered. Much could be said about the utopianism of drag balls and ballroom culture, for example, which have continued to flourish as an international phenomenon long after Paris is Burning, Judith Butler, and Madonna had had their turn with it. Also, trance music could have provided another thread in this historical account, especially the substyles of Goa trance and psytrance, both of which inherit from post-hippie psychedelic subcultures and new age movements that spread across Ibiza, Pune, and Goa, featuring utopian themes that are more introspective, more esoteric, and spiritual. Similarly, the dark, machine-like but funky techno that was emerging from Detroit during the late 1980s and 90s is relevant here, especially its paradoxical mixing of dystopian futurescapes with utopian Afrofuturism. In particular, the militant revolutionary and critically utopian Afrofuturism of Detroit's underground resistance as a collective provides a contrast to the more euphoric modes of utopianism that are more common in dance music. This historical sketch also could have jumped forward to the events that have been unfolding globally since 2010, when dubstep suddenly exploded in popularity, accompanied by a rapid mainstreaming of EDM in general, as well as the term EDM itself, much to the surprise of a lot of electronic dance music scholars such as myself. The EDM boom of the 2010s attracted a new generation of young dance music fans, although they were initially drawn to large-scale festivals rather than urban nightclubs or underground raves. In the wake of the 2008 global recession, it seems that this newer, massive, highly commercialized EDM played a role at the global level, similar to what Acid House played in Margaret Thatcher's United Kingdom. It provided a means of experiencing a sense of collective utopian future at a time when individual dreams of upward mobility were no longer so certain. And finally, this very, very short history of queer dance floor utopianism and world-making remains centered on the global north, with the US and UK as the main protagonists. This is the result of choosing disco as the starting point and following the threads with the most available information, but an alternative history needs to be written too. One that follows disco outside the North as it became global, for example. Or a history that pays attention to how queer utopian nightlife and electronic music did or didn't intersect in places like South Africa, Japan, Taiwan, India, Brazil, Uganda, China, and many more. Queer utopian dance parties, in any case, are not only dress rehearsals for better days to come, they can also create small, temporary pockets of living utopia, a brighter future that you can enjoy in the present, even if only for a night. But, as I said at the start, the tricky thing about dance floors is that they are places where both inclusion and exclusion happen. Our subcultural investment in utopianism as a strategy for survival under oppression can also make it harder for us to see who is left out or pushed out of our cherished dance floors. It is not that hard to argue for the importance of queer worlds and spaces for our survival, but it is much harder to look past what we want to see in our scene and start the truly utopian work of transforming our spaces into better worlds for all queers. Nobody is disposable. Everybody deserves a better life. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Juan Ramos, and with the context of Luis Manuel's informative excerpt, I'd like to talk about queer utopias and world building from the perspective of a DJ and promoter. I started my work in nightlife in 2009 at a New York City based booking agency, and for the last 7 years have served as the manager of Berlin's Cocktail d'Amore. The entirety of my adulthood, I have been fortunate to see both sides of this industry in a way that many people may not have the opportunity to do. The intersection of entertainment, business, and culture within dance music can sometimes negate the very real social benefits and consequences which we help to create or dismantle. So, what is it exactly that we mean when we talk about queer utopias and world building? The idea of safe spaces is most often the first thing that comes to mind. While this would be part of it, it is not the entire picture. Utopias are most often imagined future worlds which we as individuals and as collective groups create to motivate us towards more meaningful and productive social constructs. We accordingly attempt to create physical and intangible spaces, both permanent and temporary, in which to experiment towards these ends. Generally, the ideals which we use in these constructs often, but not always, coincide with the collective, and the same can be said of the individual. It is in this agreement and disagreement where we attempt to reconcile the ways in which to create improved situations for individual members of the community and for the survival and betterment of the group. The reasons for taking part in these ritualistic nights out are many and varied, but for many queer people who have moved away from their small towns into a big city, the purpose of these practices is a most certain exercise in the ways of the world in which we operate, both within and outside the walls of the club. Finding community in a new and unfamiliar place is often the primary purpose of this ritual. We can often feel alienated in the places we come from, and this newfound group embraces our unique qualities and lets us know that we are able to zestfully move through the world in ways we may not have previously thought possible for ourselves. This then serves as a launching pad for the exploration of our own identities, helping us better understand who we are as individuals and what we would like to contribute to the group dynamic. The dynamic I'm referring to here is in multiples. There are, of course, social dynamics, but there is also the physical dynamic we present on the dance floor. The way in which bodies come together, drift apart, pull and push. We can use these spaces to practice our physicality and how we want to present ourselves in the world beyond club nights. A component which is often felt but rarely expressed is the insistence on the existence of the practice itself, held in such dear regard for its life affirming qualities and its ability to validate our existence on many levels. I myself can say that without this, I would have suffered a certain level of inept sociability and perhaps never found a way to communicate with the world around me that allowed me to be comfortable. With some of the basics of the what and why out of the way, I'd like to take a look at how we might consider new ways in which to inhabit these spaces while creating a more equitable idea of utopia and how we can begin to reconstruct a world that gives space to those who most need it. We often like to think that the culture of dance music is an open and understanding one where everyone is equally valued and accepted. This idea unfortunately overlooks the fact that we as individuals and a collective still operate within societies which do not function on such standards, and that these inconsistencies bleed into the interactions had on the dance floors we so cherish. It is not an uncommon occurrence that one might feel excluded in a club for not being rich enough in any number of social currencies, whether that be beauty, youth, style, charisma, social standing, race, or gender conformity. And here's where the hard work begins within ourselves. Being a social group which is so highly intersectional, we must begin to ask ourselves how we can reimagine our own idea of utopia to more fully include others and in turn shape a new collective image of queer utopia which can truly value those most often overlooked by society at large. The idea here is equity and not charity. If we expect to create equality, we must work off a standard which sees all groups as standing on equal ground in terms of their input value. So, first, turning our attention to groups who very often may have fewer spaces in which to congregate, particularly women and BIPOC, and opening access to these spaces for them through the hiring and cooperation with these communities and club nights may be one way to start, but by no means the end all be all. By incorporating more diverse voices in the operational structures of club nights, we naturally begin to unfurl wider possibilities from which we can further progress. Another way may be in the way which parties observe the areas in which they operate. While in Berlin we have enjoyed a long run of central locations and neighborhoods which are generally considered safe and accepting of many kinds of people, this won't always remain the case. Attention must be paid to the accessibility of locations and how this can pose a barrier for people who may not be safe in these places as clubs seemingly start to spread into more far-flung corners of the city. Some parties in other cities have begun small funds at the door on a donation basis, which allows for door staff to pay for cabs for people who are most often at risk in the surrounding area. While I can only provide preliminary examples and small suggestions for solutions, I do hope that some of these points will help to start a broader conversation about better means to reach a fully equitable practice. We couldn't possibly discuss all of this without giving air to the ongoing COVID pandemic and how it has affected our community and the individuals within it. To that end, I would like to quote Austrian author Stefan Zweig's memoir, The World of Yesterday, and his portrayal of Europe following the end of World War I. Simply because our generation had suffered so much, we regarded this period of relative calm as an unexpected gift. We all had a sense that we must catch up with everything that the terrible years of the war and its immediate aftermath had stolen from our lives: happiness, freedom, the chance to concentrate on things of the mind. While many began to work from home and perfect various domestic skills, others were left in rather perilous straits. Many of those who most fervently contribute to the wonderment of our club scene were suddenly left without income and without the ability to do what they love so much: dance, socialize, and breathe life into an otherwise unremarkable landscape. Particularly for those who are younger, this period in which we begin to loosen family ties and begin to form more meaningful adult friendships had been halted virtually overnight. Left to our own devices, many turned to excessive consumption as the boredom of our new lives began to wear down on the psyche. I would urge those of us in better positions to continue to support people who have suffered in this last period. The path forward will only be forged through our collective strength and appreciation for the lives and contributions of those most affected. We should take this opportunity to come together and question how the status quo has served us or harmed us. It is often through disintegration that we can find the space to see more clearly and construct a stronger and more productive future. In many ways, one could argue that clubs are not merely museums to house culture as it happens in real time, but rather reflections of the evolution of a city. How do we imagine our next step in this evolution? I'd like to thank Ben Miller and Joao Florencio for the curation of the event and the invitation of Giacomo and Giovanni to speak. I hope that this conversation will broaden our ideas of how we can move into the next step of our cultural evolution.